What a true bracha it is to be with all of you in practice today. I want to invite us today into a simple practice, but before we do so, I'm going to do a little bit of teaching on the parsha of the week and tie it into Rosh Chodesh, which some of us may be already in, and some of us will be entering in a few hours. The parsha this week is Mishpatim, which is a series of mostly civil law, and it comes immediately on the heels of one of the most peak tradition, the giving of Torah on Mount Sinai. In last week's parasha, Yitro, we have this beautiful theophany, this moment of revelation, all of the emotions that surround that moment of revelation, awe, trembling, fear, all of that is interwoven in last week's parasha. And now, Torah, and we are receiving mishpatim. Mishpat is a law that, according to how the rabbis explain it, is the kind of a law that most human societies would have created or devised on their own to create a civil society in which everyone, ideally, of course, is treated with the utmost dignity and respect. So that's what we get this week. We get a very long series of laws in different subject areas. And it reminds me of something that the noted insight meditation teacher Jack Cornfield talks quite a bit about, which is the notion of the laundry after the ecstasy, or that notion of you have that peak experience, but actually most of life is the mundanity of everyday life. Shabbat comes once in 7 days, but most of the time it's weekday. We have our appointed holidays, but most of the time it is a standard normal weekday. How do we navigate the laundry, quote unquote, after the ecstasy, the reality of daily life after a peak spiritual experience? And I find so much wisdom in daily mindfulness practice around this exact question. Because just as in our parsha this week, Mishpatim, we have this series of laws and strictures that govern daily life and govern interpersonal conduct. So too, practice grounds us in the everyday. Sometimes in our sit, we have an insight, we experience a moment of profound transformation or self-discovery. And sometimes, and probably more often than not in our sit, we actually experience our minds going down any number of tracks. Sometimes we find ourselves in storytelling. Sometimes we find ourselves in imaginative possibility. But oftentimes we find ourselves distracted and distractible, especially in days like these. This year, we have the really interesting opportunity of the intersection between Shabbat, Mishpatim, and Shabbat Rosh Chodesh for the first of the 2 months Adar this year, Adar Rishon. We have 2 Adars because we are in a leap year. And whenever in a 19-year cycle, there are 7 years out of every 19 that are considered leap years. And in those leap years, we have this extra month to ensure that our chagim, our holidays, are in their proper time. So that this year is one of those special years. And Adar is one of these times where we experience, according to tradition, a sense of joy and happiness, and we're meant to cultivate those states. And we know that that's not always actually easy to do on the individual level or even on the communal level, especially when the circumstances of our lives belie the ability for us to find that joy. So too, often the circumstances of our lives make it feel impossible to imagine that we can continue a practice or that we're going to have any kind of joy or peak moment. But that's why we have Mishpatim, because Mishpatim helps us get there. It's like a guidepost. It allows us to create those structures, those structures and those systems that allow for the functioning of society in lots of different ways. And so too, as we build a foundation for practice, That container allows us to build a sense of consistency so that we might get to know ourselves better and experience the full range of our human emotional experience better. And sometimes when those moments on the calendar arise that call for particular emotional experience, I have found that rather than telling myself I have to find that as if it's a forced thing, I allow myself to, as we do in mindfulness practice, things arise and pass away, arise and pass away. The calendar calls for a particular kind of emotional connection, of joy and celebration. And maybe I'm there, and maybe I'm really not. But part of why we practice is to build that inner container of sanctuary for ourselves. So that, in fact, if we are there, we can feel that. And if we aren't, we acknowledge what is true for us and we continue practicing anyway without any kind of guilt or shame or I should do this or I should do that. Our tradition creates these containers because our tradition is big enough to hold all of us. So as we are entering the Shabbat of Rosh Chodesh Adar Rishon and Shabbat Mishpatim, we are simultaneously being told, make a container so that you can have a particular kind of law and way of building a society. We're told there is a new month upon us. There's a new way to begin again. And there are occasions coming up, including Purim and other special occasions on the calendar. And we get to be part of all of that wherever we are and however we are. We accept ourselves as we are, moment by moment, as we practice. And it is with that teaching that I lead us into a very basic, but nothing really truly is ever basic, a very foundational practice. We're going to do a standard mindfulness practice today, and we're going to be focusing on the anchor for our practice. Whatever your anchor is, if you are someone who's been practicing a long time, you might choose an anchor that you've worked with and that has worked for you. And I want to invite folks to assume a posture for meditation that feels right for your body. There are multiple postures that we might choose wherever you are as you are practicing along with all of us. You might sit, you might choose to walk, you might choose to stand, you might choose to lay down. Whichever posture is right for your body in this moment that allows for an alert, awake awareness and a way to connect to practice. And if you are someone who has practiced a while, you might find the anchor that works for you, be it the breath, sound, physical sensation, the feeling of your feet on the floor, the feeling of your hand on your lap. If you are newer to mindfulness practice, what we are seeking to do today is to create a state of concentration and to create a state of resiliency by returning again to our anchor and with gentle compassion when we find our minds wandering, guiding ourselves back. You might choose, if it's available to you, to work with the breath and noticing the feel of it as it naturally arises, falls away, arises, falls away. Or you might find that the better anchor for you is sound. You might notice the sounds of rising and falling away in your environment. You may find that having your feet on the ground is the best anchor. You may notice the rootedness, the feeling of the support that you're receiving, however that manifests for you. Whatever your anchor, we return again and again to this place of stability and support as a way of building up a sense of not only resilience, but as we have learned from our parsha this week, a sense of consistency, a sense of the mundanity of everyday life and everyday practice being really a grounding force in our experience. And so with that, I'm going to invite us now into a sit for about 10 minutes. And I will provide light guidance every few minutes or so. When you notice your mind inevitably wandering, with gentle compassion, guide it back to the anchor. When the mind wanders, we gently and with compassion guide it back to our anchor. And as we enter the last few moments of our sit together, we gently guide our minds back to our anchor as we remind ourselves that the consistency of our practice every day, or however often we practice, can allow ourselves to create a sense of groundedness and a sense of stability and ease. Just as our parasha invites us to create structures for social well being, our practice can create structures for our own well being. And just as the new month allows us to renew ourselves, so too can practice renew ourselves every time we take time to practice. Thank you all for sitting with me today, for practicing with me today, for your generous and kind attention. And I will now turn it back over to Miriam.
Thank you so much, Lauren. What a beautiful teaching and practice together. Friends, let's turn to Kadisha Tom, to Mourner's Kaddish. Please put in the chat names of those you're remembering today. And if you're saying Kaddish, I invite you to stand, to rise in body or in spirit. You're welcome to unmute so we can hear your voices and gather you in. If you're in the period of mourning, you're marking a yard site, the anniversary of a death, or if it's your practice to say the words of Kaddish, please join together. Gadal mikdash merabah ve'alma diva yamlich malchutai v'chayei
Yetgadal Yetkadash Merabah Balma Divrach Yote
David Kadash Rabba Almighty Kyote
Vio Mechol Cheye Dechol Beit Israel
Kol Beit Yisrael Hagala B'Zman Kari V'Mu Amen
Ishmi Rabah Mivorach Lelam Amen Torah V'Yetabach V'Yetbahar
V'Yitbar
V'Yetnaseh
V'Yitmam
V'Yetayim
V'Yitneseh
V'Yetayim
V'Yitalev V'Yithalal Shmid
Elam Kol V'Chata
Okay, thank you.
V'Chata V'Shavata
V'Nechata
V'Chata
V'Nechan
V'Nechemata
Balma Divu Amen
Gamiran
Yehi
Balma V'Mu
Shalama
Amen
B'Rami
Hey Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya
V'Chaim Aleinu
V'Chaim
B'Kol
Aleinu
Yisrael
V'Kol Yisrael V'Mu Amen Asa
Yaseh
Shalom
Shalom
B'Mamar
B'Morav Yaseh Shalom
Asa
Aleinu
Shalom
B'Kol
Aleinu
Yisrael V'Kol
V'Kol
Yoshvei
Yisrael
Tevel
V'Kol
V'Imu Amen.
Yishvei Tevel V'Imu Amen.
Amen.
El kol yoshvei tevel v'yimeru amen.
Amen.
May their memories be a blessing, and may all who are mourning be held in love and support. Amen, amen. If you need to leave at this point, I wish you blessings and goodness for your day. Those who can stay, if you have a question for Lauren, please write in bold caps and put it in the chat, put question. And you can also raise your icon, your hand, to ask a question. Just taking a look. Maybe I'll begin by really appreciating, Lauren, the way that you frame this week's Parsha and being with mundane life and practice, particularly after an ecstatic experience. I don't know how many of us have been on a meditation retreat or had a moment in nature, a moment in our lives of really feeling awake, alive, the fullness of awe, and sort of reality uncovered. And then there's the day after, or the moment after, or how we move forward in the after. I so appreciated the ways that you framed the list of laws that come in Parshat Mishpatim as really daily practice. And it brings to mind for me how many of us struggle with daily practice because it's usually not ecstatic. And the benefits and gifts aren't necessarily so obvious. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit, either reflecting on your own practice as it's developed, or anything else that you want to share about what is it that helps you stay with daily practice or regular practice?
Absolutely. What a beautiful question. I would say for me, ritual always been very important in my day to day. I think it gives a lot of structure. I often if I've like lost a routine. But I also notice that I don't want to be so rigid in routine that I'm not able to be spontaneous. And so practice for me, daily practice really arises out of a sense of creating that structure, sense of what we often call in the musar that I practice, menuchat hanefesh, a sense of the tranquility of the soul, and not in a sense of tranquility in this fanciful, everything is great kind of a way, but in the sense of navigating the ups and downs of life. And that has felt really important in the last many months and years. And some days are much harder to get to practice than others. We all have lots of demands on our time. We live in a world that places tremendous demands on our time. And there are so many things, and I am certainly, I am certainly not outside of this. There are so many things that pull at us, that distract us, that take us off the path or off the way we want to go. And for me, a lot of the work is actually choosing, how am I going? Days when I find the day is gone and I'm like, what did I do with myself today? And thinking back on the choices that I made and the things that I felt like I had to do, whether I had to do them or not. I think work can often be a place of distraction. I think anything really can be. And so I know for me, daily practice is something that I work at. It's something that is so important, and it doesn't just come, right? It doesn't just happen. You have to choose in so many ways. Like, what are the things that I'm going to prioritize? What are the things that I'm not? And we're all, I think, all of us as human beings, we are so prone to making choices that are within our comfort zone, to making the easier choice. It's kind of like what my trainer often says, the body prefers the path of least resistance. So does the mind prefer the path. So the active practice in choosing how I'm going to focus, what I'm going to prioritize. And the reason that it's so important is because the more you feel immediate, I notice that when I sit or when I walk, I've been doing a lot more walking practice recently. When I do that, I notice myself falling into that place of practice and knowing that that's somewhere I can return. And in those moments of stress or, overwhelm or whatever it is, like being able to come back there is really key for me.
Oh, that's very helpful. And actually, Pancho asks, for those of us who are not Orthodox, how do we get any structure? I'm so spontaneous, and I think you've given us some orientation around creating structure for ourselves. And you mentioned your trainers, so that system of support is also clearly so helpful. Judith writes in the chat that this daily meditation has given me a lot of structure. Thank you, IJS. It's very challenging to create that structure alone, and how helpful to have the support of others. I don't know if there's more that you want to say about that.
Well, let's actually refer directly back to Pancho, and thank you, Judith, also for your comments. I think it's really important, and I am someone who was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is a conservative rabbinical school. So when I talk about daily ritual and daily practice, that is not only in the realm of one kind of Jewish practice. That's available to all of us, regardless of our affiliation or non-affiliation, regardless of our relationship to Judaism, regardless of our relationship to spiritual practice. We are in a time of tremendous change, but all of us can, if we wish, or we all have trying to think of the right way to phrase this. It is not only the purview of those who have a more traditional practice. I am someone who has a more traditional davening practice or prayer practice, but that is not true for everyone. And people, if we think about the culture we live in and the world we live in, I think we actually, in many ways, we all have those things that we do every day. And they could be as simple as, having the same breakfast every morning. That's something that I'm finding a lot of grounding. A daily journaling practice or a gratitude practice. things, small things that we can do. It can be 3 minutes, it can be 5 minutes. We're not trying, this week's Parsha is all about coming down the mountain, although it ends at the top of the mountain again. But most of it is actually about coming down the mountain. We're not trying to aim for something that we're not going to reach. That's not the point of Jewish spirituality, as I understand it. We really elevate the mundane and we make that holy. And we try to find things in our daily lives are small, but we know we're going to be successful at. And we choose those things so that we can come back to them as our anchor, as our grounding practice.
Lovely. There's some other, your voice is cutting in and out a little bit. So just to let others know that that's happening a little bit, that's okay. We're going to do our best with the technology, but just picking up on a little bit more of this thread of ongoing practice. There were a couple comments here that I think are worth lifting up. One is about a question of it can be challenging to notice that we're growing, that the daily practice is having an impact. And I can say that for myself, because it's about cultivating a new habit, the regularity of practice in and of itself is a place of noticing growth. If I keep showing up, that in itself is, I don't even want to call it progress, because it's practice is practice every day. It's I am showing up. It is, and sometimes I'm not, and I notice that too. So less on a scale of succeeding or failing, and more about here we are in practice. And that's a muscle, maybe, instead of thinking of it as strengthening as opposed to progress. But noticing impact can be quite subtle. So that's just worth naming, I think. And the other thing is that building a new habit, whether it's a healthy breakfast every day, or regular exercise, or sitting practice, is likely to surface resistance. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about resistance.
Absolutely. And before we do so, can everyone hear me? I didn't realize there was an audio glitch.
Now it sounds clearer, and I mute myself in between, so hopefully that helps.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you all. As we always say in practice, this too is practice. So thanks for your understanding as we resistance. Certainly something that I myself struggle with constantly. And I know in my experience, I feel that I'm almost wired towards the path of least resistance. It's almost like easier to do the thing that is easier, and it's harder to actually work with the resistance. And I'm going to use again a metaphor that my trainer brought to me, which it's very interesting how all of, the physical and the spiritual are so interconnected. We don't push our muscles so hard that we end up injuring them, right? The muscle is going to go as far as the muscle is going to go. And I'm often reminded that even when I want to push harder, my muscle doesn't always want to push harder. So I have to be aligned with what my muscle actually wants, right? Because if I'm not, then there will be a price to pay. And with practice, we're not always feeling or experiencing on the conscious level the results of practice. But I think what we need to do, I think what's important for us to do, is to redirect ourselves away from a results-driven way of thinking, because our culture has conditioned us that way. Take this particular diet and in 30 days, X, Y, and Z, right? We have so much of that messaging, so much of that deeply unhelpful messaging. And because we have so much of that messaging, it can feel hard to redirect ourselves. So I invite us, when it comes to resistance, to honoring it. And days when it's just not working, maybe we only sit for 3 minutes. 3 minutes is great. That's 3 minutes you sat, or 3 minutes you walked, or whatever it is. And it's just about honoring where we are so that we actually can move forward. And we know, rather than, for example, another example of this is I'm always thinking about my step counter. And I am to the point where I'm like, I have to just remove this because I am constantly examining it and measuring myself against a step counter, which is inherently inaccurate because I don't live with my phone tethered to me at all times. So too, if I'm thinking about results, I need to be thinking about the changes, the micro changes, not the macro, but the micro that I experience over time. And that I feel can be attributed to the way I practice, whether it's on the cushion or off the cushion.
That is so helpful. Such a valuable reminder of some of the unwholesome drives and orientations that are part of our culture, and a very sort of consumerist oriented culture that's about what we acquire and certain kinds of results that are prized and appreciated and pushed for. Very helpful. I just want to share, we only have a minute left to share a question/comment that Rana wrote. Isn't it possible that if we were to bring the awareness associated with the extraordinary moments to the mundane, then would the mundane be so mundane? I think that's quite lovely in the sense that as we sit with what's not ecstatic, but is ordinary, and we sit with it with presence, we start to notice subtleties that are quite magnificent. I don't know if there's maybe a closing comment that you'd like to share about the mundane.
Beautiful. There's, I really couldn't have put it better. So thank you, Rana, for that. I think that is so true. And when we collect those subtleties, we're telling our nervous system, this here is something for us to be joyful. Conditioning ourselves and allowing ourselves to explore different kind of pathways.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And I want to share, there are a lot of words of appreciation in the chat for you, Lauren. So thank you so much for guiding us. Thank you, Harry, for your tech support. And again, thank you, Linda Josephs, for sponsoring today's sit in honor of your mother's memory. Much gratitude to everyone for being here. Wishing you blessings for your day.